New York City has a way of swallowing you whole. For anyone trying to survive on a freelancer's budget, the city isn't a postcard, it's an unforgiving labyrinth of skyrocketing rents and dwindling bank accounts. Leo was intimately familiar with the grind. As a freelance video editor, his life was a blur of blue light screens, deep dark circles under his eyes, and the suffocating anxiety that hit at the end of every month when rent was due. He had been subletting a cramped, miserable room in Manhattan, watching his savings slowly bleed to zero when he stumbled upon the Craigslist ad. It felt like a clerical error. A cozy, fully furnished studio apartment on the fourth floor of a historic brick building in a quiet pocket of Brooklyn. The price? $600 a month. In the New York housing market, finding a deal like that is the equivalent of winning the lottery or finding water in a desert. Leo didn't stop to ask questions. He closed his laptop, grabbed his jacket, and took the first subway train out to Brooklyn. The building itself was unnervingly quiet when he arrived. A brisk late May breeze rustled the overgrown ivy climbing up the red brick facade. The landlord, man named Mr. Vance, looked as old as the foundation of the building itself. His frame was severely hunched, and his eyes were clouded over with milky cataracts. When he handed Leo the keys, his hands shook violently. Leo brushed it off as the tremors of old age, but looking back, he would wonder if it was actually something else entirely. Fear, perhaps. As they signed the lease, Mr. Vance placed a cold, skeletal hand on Leo's shoulder. His voice was raspy and heavy, carrying the stale, damp scent of a room that hadn't seen sunlight in decades.
"Leo," the old man murmured, his eyes staring past him. "I'm glad you like the place, but there are conditions to living here. If you want to keep your peace, you follow them to the letter. First, inside the walk-in closet in the bedroom, there's a small wooden door built into the back wall. You leave it alone. You never, under any circumstance, open it. Second, if you ever hear knocking or tapping coming from inside that closet in the middle of the night, you do not answer it. You don't try to investigate. You grab your phone, turn on your speakers, and you blast music as loud as it goes. You drown out that sound until it stops." Leo had smiled to himself, nodding politely. Classic New York quirks, he thought. Every old building in the boroughs came with an eccentric landlord who believed in ghosts or had some bizarre, decades-old OCD routine. He figured the old man was just lonely and paranoid. He shook his hand, pocketed the keys, and moved his few belongings into the fourth-floor studio that very night. For the first 3 days, the apartment was an absolute dream. The walls were thick, completely insulating him from the chaotic symphony of city sirens and traffic below. Even though spring was turning into summer, the New York nights remained chilly, and the building's ancient iron radiator hissed and groaned reliably, filling the studio with a comforting, cozy warmth. Leo felt a profound sense of relief. For the first time since moving to the city, he had his own sanctuary. He could work in peace. He could sleep. He had no idea that this peaceful silence was merely the eye of a gathering storm. Everything shattered on the fourth night. The clock on his laptop screen read exactly 2:15 a.m. The rest of Brooklyn was dead silent, buried under the weight of the early morning hours. Leo was sitting at his desk, headphones pushed firmly against his ears, editing a tense sequence for an indie thriller. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, flickering blue glow of his monitor, throwing long shadows against the walls. He paused a clip on his timeline to take a sip of water, and that was when he heard it. A sound, distinct, sharp, and cut through the silence of the room. Leo pulled his headphones down to his neck and sat perfectly still, holding his breath. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the far right corner of the room, from the inside of the walk-in closet. Leo tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just a pocket of air trapped in the old pipes, or maybe a stray rat scratching at the floorboards. He stood up, his bare feet pressing against the cold hardwood, and took a few hesitant steps toward the closet door. But the closer he got, the clearer the sound became. It wasn't the dull thud of a pipe. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and deeply impatient. It sounded exactly like someone with long, hard acrylic fingernails tapping sharply against solid wood. Tap, tap, tap. An icy chill snaked its way down Leo's spine, freezing the air in his lungs. Suddenly, Mr. Vance's trembling voice echoed in his mind. If you hear tapping from inside that closet, do not answer it. Blast music as loud as it goes. Panic seized him. He bolted back across the room, knocking his desk chair over, and grabbed his phone. With trembling thumbs, he opened Spotify, selected the loudest, heaviest metal playlist he could find, and maxed out the volume. The speakers exploded with a wall of distorted guitars and thundering drums. The aggressive music tore through the quiet apartment, completely swallowing the rhythmic scratching from the closet. Leo retreated to his bed, pulling his knees up to his chest, his eyes locked onto the white closet door. He stayed like that for hours, terrified to lower the volume, until the first rays of dawn finally broke over the Manhattan skyline. The next morning, bathed in the safety of bright golden sunlight, Leo felt a surge of foolish bravery. The terrors of the night always seem absurd in the clarity of day. Determined to prove to himself that he was losing his mind over nothing, he marched into the walk-in closet. He pushed aside his hanging jackets, hoodies, and coats, revealing the dark, forgotten corner at the back. There it was, a small, weathered wooden door, barely 3 feet high. A heavy, antique iron latch secured it, so deeply rusted that it looked practically fused shut. Leo frowned, tapping the surrounding drywall. According to the building's layout, there shouldn't be anything on the other side of this wall except the narrow, empty air shaft between tenements. No one could possibly be standing out there on the 4th floor tapping on a wall. It had to be an echo from an adjacent apartment. He forced himself to believe that, but a lingering knot of unease remained tight in his stomach. That evening, the weather turned violent. A massive, unseasonal thunderstorm rolled over the tri-state area. Sheets of torrential rain lashed against Leo's main window, and the wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city. As night fell, the storm only grew fiercer. Leo lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the phantom echoes of the previous night. At exactly 3 a.m., a blinding flash of lightning struck somewhere nearby, followed instantly by a deafening clap of thunder that shook the entire building. Then, the power went out. The apartment vanished into pitch-black darkness. The hum of the refrigerator died. The radiator fell silent, and the only light came from the erratic, violent strobing of lightning through the rain-slicked window pane. And then, over the roar of the storm, the sound returned.
But it wasn't the delicate, impatient tapping of a fingernail anymore. This was different. This was aggressive, heavy, wet. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like something fleshy and massive slamming itself against the wood. With every strike, Leo could swear he felt the air pressure in his room drop, the temperature plummeting until his breath plumed into faint white mist in the dark.
Leo lunged towards his desk, his hands frantically sweeping across the surface for his phone. He needed the music, he needed to drown it out. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal of his phone and he pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained black. The battery was dead. He was entirely exposed. No lights, no music, no escape. Just him, the storm, and whatever was throwing itself against the door in the closet. Thump, thump, thump. Leo backed away until his spine hit the dry wall behind his bed, clutching the blanket to his chest. His heart hammered so violently against his ribs it felt like it would crack them open. And then a sound cut through the thunder that made his blood turn to ice. Crack! The heavy iron latch on the small door snapped under immense pressure, the rusted metal shearing in two and clattering onto the floorboards inside the closet. Leo's gaze was glued to the darkness. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the bedroom, and in that fleeting blue-tinted second, he watched the main closet door slowly, smoothly swing open. From the pitch-black void inside, a foul, overpowering stench began to bleed into the room. It smelled of stagnant water, wet earth, and ancient, undisturbed decay. Leo was entirely paralyzed. Every muscle in his body refused to move, locked in a primal, evolutionary state of pure terror. His mind fractured as he stared into the 3-foot opening. Another violent bolt of lightning lit up the room, and for one agonizing second, Leo saw what lay beyond the door. There was no brick wall. There was no empty air shaft. The small opening led into a massive, cavernous room that was a flawless mirror image of his own studio apartment. But everything in it was rotting, covered in a thick, velvety layer of black mold and cobwebs. And standing right in the center of that decayed reflection was a figure. It possessed a human silhouette, but its proportions were entirely monstrous. Its arms and legs were stretched out, freakishly long, as if the bones had been broken and elongated. Its skin was completely hairless, translucent, and a sickly, wet paper white, revealing a web of dark, pulsing veins underneath. The lightning faded, plunging the room back into darkness, but Leo could hear it moving. Slither, snap, click.
Another flash of lightning. The entity was no longer in the center of the mirror room. It was at the threshold of the small door, crawling through on all fours like a massive, distorted spider. Its head wasn't upright. It was tilted at a horrific, unnatural 90-degree angle, resting almost flat against its elongated shoulder. And it had no eyes. Where its eyes should have been, there were only 2 hollow, bottomless black pits staring directly into Leo's soul. The creature dragged its elongated torso completely into Leo's bedroom, its joints popping and snapping as it forced itself upright. It faced the bed, its jaw unhinging, stretching open incredibly wide. Leo braced himself, waiting for a demonic roar, a guttural scream, or a beastly howl. But what came out of that mouth was infinitely worse. It was a voice Leo recognized instantly because he heard it every single day. But it was glitched, stuttering and fragmenting like a corrupted digital audio file, a distorted, robotic mockery of human speech. It was Leo's own voice. The creature spoke, its stolen words echoing off the walls of the dark apartment. "Thanks for opening the door, Leo. I hate being sublet."
The sky outside erupted in one final blinding flash of lightning. In that ultimate microsecond of light, Leo watched the creature's long, pale, wet hand reach out across the darkness, its sharp, elongated fingers wrapping firmly around the edge of his mattress. Then the lightning died, the thunder faded, and the room was swallowed by an absolute suffocating darkness, leaving nothing but the steady downpour of the rain and the sound of something wet dragging itself across the bed.
The next story. Midwestern years are inherently cruel. But in Chicago, when a polar vortex hits, the city doesn't just freeze, it transforms into a sprawling white graveyard. The wind howling off Lake Michigan doesn't just bite, it tears through you, making the fragile warmth of an indoor space the only thing standing between you and a freezing death. For 24-year-old Ethan, this level of cold was entirely alien. Having spent his whole life in Southern California, winter to him meant nothing more than throwing on a light hoodie. Chicago's bone-chilling frost, however, settled deep into his skeleton. Desperate for a cheap place to crash while finishing his degree, Ethan had taken a studio apartment in a dilapidated pre-war brick building downtown. Built sometime in the 1920s, the place practically oozed neglect. The plaster on the hallway walls was peeling like sunburnt skin, and a thick, stagnant smell of damp dust hung permanently in the air. But the rent was dirt cheap, so Ethan signed the lease. The only saving grace of the entire apartment was a massive, ornate cast iron radiator sitting directly beneath the window. It was a relic of the past, but when it fired up, it hissed and clanked, bleeding enough intense steam heat to keep the bitter Chicago winter at bay. But on his very first night, Ethan noticed something off. It was exactly 1:45 a.m., and the temperature outside had plummeted well below zero. Ethan was buried beneath 3 layers of blankets, trying to drift off to sleep when the heavy iron radiator in the corner suddenly shuddered to life with a violent, deafening racket. Clang, clang, clang.
Now, anyone who has ever lived in an old American apartment knows that noisy pipes are just part of the charm. Steam pressure traps air, causing the metal to bang. But this sound wasn't random. As Ethan sat up in bed, straining his ears in the dark, he realized the banging had a deliberate, unsettling rhythm. It didn't sound like trapped steam. It sounded like someone was trapped inside the wall, taking a heavy, blunt object and rhythmically smashing it against the iron from the inside out. Clang, clang, clang. Shivering against the draft, Ethan swung his legs out of bed. He walked over to the corner, his bare feet stinging against the freezing hardwood floor. Assuming the pressure was just too high, he reached down and turned the heavy brass intake valve. With a loud, pressurized hiss, a cloud of hot steam escaped into the room, and the banging instantly stopped. Exhausted, Ethan let out a sigh of relief, crawled back into bed, and finally fell asleep. The next morning, Ethan ran into the building superintendent, an old weathered man named Mr. Green, down in the lobby. The super was holding a steaming mug of black coffee, but when Ethan casually brought up the loud rhythmic clanking of the radiator, Mr. Green's hand froze. The coffee trembled in his grip. He slowly raised his eyes, staring at Ethan with a hollow, haunted look. "That ain't air in the pipes, kid," Mr. Green whispered, his voice dropping to a raspy, defensive tone. "The boy who lived in 3B before you, he complained about the exact same thing.
said he could hear someone whispering his name through the vents at night. We thought he was losing his mind, but then, one night during a blizzard, he just vanished. The cops tossed the place, tore up the floorboards, found nothing. But let me give you a piece of advice, Ethan. If that radiator ever shuts off in the dead of night and the room goes ice cold, do not look at it. Pull the covers over your head and close your eyes. Whatever is in there, it hates the light. Ethan scoffed as he walked away, completely dismissing the old man's warning. He figured it was just a classic scare tactic, a spooky story cooked up by an eccentric super to explain away a faulty ancient plumbing system. But Ethan had no idea that the brutal Chicago winter was about to unleash a nightmare he couldn't rationalize away.
By Friday night, a historic blizzard hit the city. Outside the window, the world was completely white out, a chaotic vortex of blinding snow and roaring winds that made the glass panes rattle violently in their frames. By 2 a.m., Ethan was sitting at his desk, desperately trying to finish a midterm paper. Suddenly, the radiator let out a sharp, dying hiss, and the comforting hum of the building's boiler room went dead silent. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, plunging like a stone. Within minutes, his fingers grew stiff over his keyboard. When he exhaled, his breath plumed into thick, ghostly white clouds of vapor right inside his own bedroom. The cold was unnatural, a heavy, suffocating frost that seemed to seep directly out of the walls. Shivering violently, Ethan grabbed his flashlight from his nightstand. If the heat was out for the night, he was going to freeze. He clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam across the room, illuminating the dark cast-iron frame of the radiator. Clang! A sharp metallic echo rang out, but it didn't come from inside the pipes this time. It came from the narrow gap between the back of the radiator and the ancient drywall. Ethan focused the beam of light, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief. Something was oozing out from the metal fins of the radiator. It wasn't water, and it wasn't steam. It was a thick, viscous, tar-like black fluid. It dripped heavily onto the floorboards, sizzling as it touched the freezing air. But instead of flattening out or freezing solid on the cold floor, the sludge began to pool, expanding, rising, and defying gravity as it crawled upward. Ethan scrambled backward, his chair screeching against the floor until his back hit the far wall. His jaw tightened, frozen in place by an overwhelming wave of pure, primal terror. In the pale beam of the flashlight, the black fluid coalesced, stretching upward until it formed a towering 7-foot-tall humanoid silhouette. The body had no skin. Its body looked like charred, blackened meat coated in a layer of weeping soot. Its limbs were impossibly long and emaciated, and the tips of its skeletal fingers ended not in nails, but jagged, rusted shards of iron. But the most horrifying part was its face. It had no eyes, no nose, no ears. There was only a massive, jagged fissure of a mouth that stretched completely from one side of its misshapen head to the other. Billowing clouds of scalding red-hot steam poured continuously from the open wound of its mouth, hissing violently the moment it collided with the freezing air of the room. Mr. Green's words echoed like a siren in Ethan's mind. "It hates the light. Do not look at it." In a panic, Ethan clicked the flashlight off, plunging the apartment back into total darkness. The only sound was the howling blizzard outside. Ethan slid down the wall onto the floor, pulling his knees to his chest and squeezing his eyes shut.
He began to pray, silently begging his mind to wake up from what had to be a hallucination. But in the dark, when you close your eyes, your other senses only amplify. Schlich, drag, schlich, drag.
The sound of something heavy, wet and metallic dragging itself across the hardwood floor began to echo through the dark. It was moving away from the radiator. It was stepping into the center of the room, heading straight toward his desk. The crisp, clean scent of the winter snow vanished, replaced instantly by the foul, nauseating stench of burning copper and scorched human flesh. Ethan pressed himself as hard as he could against the wall, trying to become invisible. His heart was beating so loud he was terrified the thing would hear it. The dragging sound stopped, right at the edge of his bed. Suddenly, the air directly above Ethan's head shifted. The ambient temperature skyrocketed from freezing to an unbearable blistering heat. A thick wave of scalding, humid steam washed over his face, melting the sweat on his forehead. The entity was standing right over him. Ethan kept his eyes fiercely shut, but he could feel the immense, radiant heat of the monster radiating downwards, hovering inches away. Right then, a violent gust of wind outside slammed a heavy sheet of ice against the window. The glass shattered, a loud crash echoing through the room as the freezing wind and the strobing headlights of a distant snowplow flooded the apartment with a sudden burst of light. Instinctively, out of pure reflex, Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was staring directly into the abyss. The 7-foot charred abomination was leaning down, its massive, jagged mouth opening wider, exposing a throat lined with glowing red-hot iron coils. As the steam hissed past Ethan's ears, a voice crawled out from the creature's throat. It didn't sound human. It sounded like the grinding of rusted gears, a scraping metallic screech that rasped out his name. Ethan. You won't find the California sun out here. Come inside the pipes with us. It's so warm in here, so nice. The entity raised a blackened, iron-clawed hand, reaching directly for Ethan's face. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but before any sound could escape, the blistering, white-hot palm slammed down over his mouth and nose, suffocating him in a cloud of scalding steam. The next morning, after the blizzard had finally passed, Mr. Green walked up to the 3rd floor to check on the tenants. When he reached room 3B, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the apartment was a frozen wasteland. The window was entirely blown out, and a thick layer of fresh snow covered the desk, the bed, and the floor. But Ethan was completely gone. When the police arrived to investigate the disappearance, they found no signs of a break-in, no blood, no footprints in the snow. The only clue left behind was on the ancient cast-iron radiator in the corner. Scorched deep into the frozen metal were the distinct, melted outlines of 2 human hands. It looked exactly like someone had been dragged inside, frantically clawing at the iron from the inside out, trying to escape a heat that never ended.